In the vastness of an American mansion, a young maid spent hours preparing every detail for her millionaire boss's dinner. Her hands trembled between glasses and candles, but her heart burned with hope. Perhaps that night he would finally notice her. She set the table as if it were an altar, scattered discreet flowers, and let each gesture speak silently for her. But when the door opened, the sight shattered everything. The millionaire did not enter alone. Beside him, a glamorous woman, covered in jewelry and perfume, took the place of honor without even noticing the dedication that had preceded her. The maid, standing at a distance, felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. All her dedication, all her hidden love, seemed to have been trampled underfoot in seconds. And yet she didn't know that fate, patient and relentless, was beginning to set the pieces in motion for a turnaround that would forever change not only her life, but also that man's heart. The guests' laughter echoed through the room, mingling with the clinking of glasses while the waitress walked away with teary eyes. Humiliated, invisible, she felt she could never compete with the brilliance that overshadowed her own dignity. But the following days would reveal something beyond pain. Behind that woman's impeccable smile lay ambition, lies, and danger. The millionaire, blinded by vanity, would be slow to realize it, but when the truth came out, it would be too late to go back to the beginning. And, at the center of it all, the young maid, who silently bore the wounds of contempt, would become the pillar no one expected. Amid tears and secrets, life would lead them to a climax where masks would fall and hearts would be tested. And in the end, when justice was served, not only would the truth remain, there would also be the chance for a love that had been born where no one dared believe. If this story touched your heart, please like it, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments if you also believe that true love can blossom where you least expect it. The Crawford mansion seemed untouchable, built with imposing columns and windows reflecting the city's glow. Inside, however, lay an invisible world that had no place in the gilded halls or the lavish parties. The world of the young maid, who walked each hallway with light steps, carrying not only trays, but dreams she had never dared confess. Her days were filled with silence, with tiny notes in a worn notebook, with small gestures that no one saw, adjusting a curtain to keep the sun out, discreetly replacing a cracked glass, watering the roses before they wilted. Everything was cared for, everything was hidden love. And that night, there was something different in the air. The millionaire boss was returning from a business trip, and the maid believed, even if only for a moment, that she might be noticed. She prepared the table as if preparing an altar, linens lined, glasses shining like crystals, lit candles, casting a soft glow on the silverware. Every detail was a silent confession, a secret request that upon entering, he would feel something he couldn't explain, but that came from her. Her heart was beating fast, and her hands trembled amidst the flowers and plates. It wasn't just dinner, it was her soul that was laid out on the table. The library clock announced the hour with a deep thud. Her heart raced. She heard the car's engine approaching, the tires squealing on the gravel driveway, the firm footsteps echoing on the marble. For a second she let herself dream that he would enter alone, weary from the journey, and find refuge in the perfect setting. Maybe he would smile, maybe he would thank her. Maybe, just for an instant, he would see her. But the door opened, and what followed was a cruel stroke of fate. The millionaire entered elegantly, confident as ever, but he was not alone. Beside him, a stunning woman in a shimmering dress and striking perfume immediately occupied the space the maid had secretly desired. Her laughter filled the room before a word was even spoken. The millionaire smiled at his guest, pulled out her chair, and toasted the evening, oblivious to the tired hands that had prepared every detail. The maid, motionless in the corner of the room, felt the blood drain from her face. Dinner, which for her had been a source of hope, had become a scene of humiliation. Every candle seemed to mock her naivete, every dish a reminder that she had no place at that table. And yet she stood there, steadfast, swallowing her tears so no one would see them. In the silence of her heart, a certainty began to dawn. No one can humiliate true love without fate one day, returning each tear in the form of justice. The dinner progressed like a rehearsed spectacle for two protagonists, the millionaire and his glamorous guest. The candles cast golden shadows across the table, the wine sparkled in the glasses, and her laughter filled every space like music. For the maid, who stood in a corner, each laugh was a stab, each gesture of affection between them an open wound. She, who had prepared everything hoping to be seen, was now just part of the scenery, invisible as the walls that supported such luxury. The guest, who soon began to be called Victoria, soon noticed the maid's presence. Her eyes roamed the room haughtily, and when they landed on the uniformed young woman, they gleamed with arrogance. "You have dedicated servants, Ethan," she commented, honeyedly, holding the glass with ring-covered fingers. "It's almost as if they want to impress someone." The millionaire chuckled absently, unaware of the venom in his words. The maid's heart sank, but she kept her head down, gripping the tray tightly, as if it were her only defense. With each course served, Victoria found a way to hurt without seeming cruel. She commented that the food was almost good, that the tablecloth could have been better ironed, that the flowers were too simple for such a special dinner. Ethan didn't notice, fascinated by the glamorous company, but for the maid each word was a stone thrown at her dignity. Still, she endured it in silence, without shedding a tear in front of them. When dessert arrived, Victoria laughed loudly and said in a clear voice so everyone could hear, "I can only imagine how sad it must be to prepare a table that will never be yours." The comment echoed like a sentence. The distracted millionaire smiled dismissively, but the maid felt her legs weaken. Still, she didn't respond, didn't show weakness. She held the pain in her chest, transforming it into a silent weight that only fate could lift. After dinner, when the two retired to the living room, the maid remained alone in the hall. She blew out the candles with trembling hands, collected the plates still marked by Victoria's lipstick, and cleaned each glass as if to erase the memories of that night. But no matter how hard she scrubbed, she couldn't erase the feeling that she had been reduced to nothing. Looking at herself in the reflection of a glass, she saw her own eyes welling up and realized it wasn't just the exhaustion of work. It was the pain of a heart that had loved in silence and had been crushed by indifference. Later, lying in her simple room at the back of the mansion, she wept silently, muffling the sound in her pillow so no one would hear. Each tear seemed to engrave in her soul the promise that she would not let herself be destroyed by this. She desired no revenge, planned no evil. She simply prayed to the universe that one day someone would see the value hidden in her silence. Meanwhile, upstairs, the millionaire toasted Victoria, enchanted by the dazzling brilliance. He didn't realize that, by choosing what glittered, he was disregarding what sustained his own home. But fate, patient and relentless, was already beginning to weave the twist. Victoria showed signs of ambition that no one saw, but which would soon surface. And the maid, who that night felt invisible and humiliated, was destined to become the invisible thread that would hold the whole story together when the masks fell. The following days brought with them an almost imperceptible change in the mansion, but one that the maid felt in every detail. Victoria's presence, which initially seemed fleeting, became constant. She walked the halls as if she already owned the house, giving orders to the servants, choosing menus, and even deciding how the flowers should be arranged. Her striking perfume permeated the air, and her voice, heavy with superiority, echoed like a cruel reminder that the space that had once belonged to Grace's silence was now taken over by vanity. The maid endured in silence. She continued to perform her duties with dedication, but increasingly became the target of petty humiliations. Victoria seemed to find pleasure in belittling her in front of others. One morning, upon seeing her polishing the crystal glasses, she commented loudly, for all to hear, "Interesting how some people can spend their entire lives serving, yet never be worthy of sitting at the table." The comment made the other servants lower their eyes in embarrassed silence, but Grace simply continued her work, hiding her pain behind a forced calm. The millionaire, blinded by his superficial admiration for Victoria, was oblivious to the cruelty of his words. Fascinated by her brilliance, the way she presented herself to guests, and her supposed business savvy. He allowed her to become increasingly involved in his life. In meetings, he already accepted her suggestions, and at events, he made a point of displaying her by his side as a symbol of power and prestige. Grace watched in silence, feeling that, little by little, the truth about this woman was being obscured by a veil of luxury and appearance. But fate rarely allows masks to last long, and the waitress, in her simplicity, began to notice cracks in Victoria's impeccable image. Small slips, loose words on the phone, cold looks when she thought she wasn't being observed. One afternoon, Grace entered the library to organize her books and found Victoria speaking harshly into her cell phone. "He'll sign, don't worry. I know exactly how to manipulate him. It's only a matter of time." Upon noticing the waitress's presence, she abruptly ended the call and gave her an icy, threatening look that spoke more than 1,000 words. Grace didn't tell anyone, but that sentence stuck in her mind. As she organized her books, her hands trembled. For the first time, she felt not just pain for herself, but concern for her boss. No matter how much he despised her, she couldn't ignore what she'd heard. Something inside her told her Victoria wasn't there just for love or companionship, but for something darker, more calculated. In the pantry, the other employees were also beginning to murmur. Discreet gossip claimed Victoria meddled in contracts, talked too much about money, pushed for changes. That made no sense, but no one dared confront her. Grace remained silent as always, but now with her heart torn between personal grief and the certainty that the house was heading for an abyss. Ethan, though still blind, was already beginning to feel slight discomfort. The charm that had once enchanted him now felt at times suffocating. Sometimes, in the middle of meetings or over long dinners, he would catch Grace's gaze flicking over him, and there was something in that silence that weighed, more heavily than Victoria's words, but he still couldn't understand it. The mansion, once a mere stage for luxury, was transformed into a board game of invisible pieces. Victoria believed she controlled the game. The millionaire still let himself be carried away by the glitter, and Grace, the scorned maid, silently kept secrets that could change the course of history. Fate had already begun its plot, and sooner or later the truth would come out, not as revenge, but as inevitable justice. As the weeks passed, Victoria no longer hid her ambition. She moved around the mansion as if she were the real Mrs. Crawford, imposing her presence on every detail. She requested changes to the decor, demanded more elaborate menus, criticized the staff's work, and always found a way to belittle Grace. What were once veiled comments now became direct, venomous attacks. With each word, Grace felt her heart ache, but she also realized something bigger was going on. The more Victoria tried to shine, the more her true colors revealed themselves. At a dinner with the millionaire's influential friends, tension reached a breaking point. Grace was discreetly serving the table when Victoria, noticing a small, almost invisible stain on the tablecloth, smiled cruelly and said aloud in front of everyone, "It's amazing how some people can't even take care of the basics. Maybe it's a lack of talent, or perhaps a lack of space." The guests' suppressed laughter was like silent daggers. Grace lowered her head, controlling the tears that threatened to fall. Ethan, sitting at the head of the table, looked up for a moment and looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. That, however, was the first crack. For the first time, he didn't laugh, didn't reinforce Victoria's words. He simply observed the heavy silence in the room and the teary eyes of the maid who continued serving as if nothing had happened. Victoria sensed this discomfort and, instead of backing down, pushed even further. She began to dictate rules that went beyond household etiquette, questioning suppliers, ordering changes to service contracts, and even interfering in business meetings. Ethan tried to remain calm, but in moments of solitude, he felt suffocated. There was no longer tenderness, only demands. The woman who had once seemed fascinating now sounded authoritarian, obsessed with control. Grace, for her part, watched everything in silence. In her heart, there was still pain from the humiliation, but also a strange certainty. Victoria's false glow would not last. In her discreet notebooks, she continued to jot down deliveries, bills, and routine details. It was her way of keeping the house together, even when the emotional foundations were crumbling. The situation reached a new climax when a bottle of rare wine disappeared from the cellar. Victoria didn't hesitate. In front of Ethan and the team, she pointed directly at Grace. Maybe someone got distracted, or maybe they took it home without realizing it. The accusation fell like a bolt of lightning. Grace felt her face heat up, but before she could respond, the head of security informed her that he had reviewed the cameras. An employee Victoria had recently hired had entered the cellar without authorization. The silence that followed was revealing. Victoria laughed forcefully, trying to hide it. Oh, it must have been a mistake. But Ethan didn't respond. His gaze, cold and calculated, rested on her for a few seconds too long. That night, he couldn't sleep. He replayed every detail in his mind: the cruel smile at dinner, the unjust accusation against Grace, the business reports that didn't add up. For the first time, he admitted to himself that he might be being manipulated. And as he stared at the ceiling, the strongest memory wasn't Victoria's glare, but the image of the maid silently bowing her head, enduring it all without retaliating. Fate, patiently, began to align the pieces. Victoria believed she was in control, but her arrogance was living proof that her downfall was near, and Ethan, though he didn't yet have all the answers, already sensed in his heart that something was wrong. Grace, invisible to the eyes of many, was the only one who remained steadfast, even in the face of injustice, and it would be precisely this quiet strength that would soon become the key to the inevitable turnaround. With each passing day, Victoria seemed more impatient. If she had previously feigned sweetness to gain space, now she no longer made any effort to hide her desire for control. She began frequenting Ethan's office frequently, reviewing papers uninvited, offering her opinions in meetings as if she were a partner. Her voice echoed with an authoritative tone, repeating phrases like, "Trust me, Ethan, I know what's best for your future." He tried to maintain his composure, but deep inside, he felt a growing discomfort he couldn't name. Grace, observant and silent, noticed everything. From inside the pantry, while organizing purchasing reports and checking supplier lists, she overheard snippets of conversations that increasingly revealed Victoria's true nature. Words like risky investment, quick transfer, and advantageous partnerships cropped up frequently in her phone calls. More than once, the maid found herself stopping her duties to pay attention, sensing that this wasn't just ambition, but manipulation. The climax came one Friday night, when Ethan, exhausted after hours of meetings, walked into the kitchen for a drink of water. He found Grace discreetly arranging the dishes. She was startled to see him, but he remained still, watching her. For a few seconds there was silence. Then, almost in a fit of frustration, he said, "It's strange. The more I think I have everything, the more I feel like something's missing." Grace lowered her eyes without responding. But that moment marked the beginning of a change. For the first time, Ethan no longer looked at her as invisible. Meanwhile, Victoria intensified the pressure. She insisted that Ethan sign contracts with companies linked to her family, promising astronomical profits. He, suspicious, asked for more detailed reports. Her response was harsh. "Don't you trust me?" It sounded like a warning. The woman who had once seemed fascinating now revealed a side obsessed with dominance. Ethan, still torn, began seeking advice from lawyers and former partners, and the more he listened, the more he noticed inconsistencies in the projects Victoria presented. Amidst this storm, Grace's presence became increasingly symbolic. Her small gestures gained weight. The hot tea left on his desk after long meetings, the precisely organized papers that made his life easier, the patience with which she tended to the details no one noticed. Ethan, without admitting it aloud, began to notice that the peace he so desperately needed only came when she was near. One afternoon, an investor visited the mansion to discuss new ventures. Victoria, with her glamorous air, tried to monopolize the conversation, but one detail slipped through. Documents that should have been ready were poorly organized. Ethan was visibly uncomfortable. until Grace discreetly appeared with the correct folder, which she had previously set aside out of habit. The investor, surprised, praised her efficiency. Victoria shot the maid a cold look, but Ethan, for the first time, smiled in her direction, as if recognizing the importance of that simple gesture. That night, Victoria tried to regain ground with caresses and promises, but Ethan remained distant, distracted, thinking about the scene with the investor and the calm he'd felt when Grace had resolved everything. The comparison was inevitable. On one side, the false glow. On the other, the quiet loyalty. Fate, as always, wouldn't let it go unnoticed. Masks were breaking. Victoria, increasingly aggressive in her quest for power, was paving the way for her own downfall. Grace, without even realizing it, was becoming the firm root that held everything together, and Ethan was finally beginning to see the difference between what merely glitters and what truly illuminates. Victoria's mask was beginning to crack more and more visibly. Whereas before she could disguise her arrogance with smiles and charm, now her outbursts were frequent and difficult to contain. All it took was a single detail out of place for her fury to surface. That week, during an intimate luncheon organized for 2 investors, she became enraged because the flowers delivered weren't the exact color she'd requested. In the middle of the room, she raised her voice against the suppliers and, without mincing words, blamed Grace in front of everyone. "Isn't anyone here even qualified to choose flowers?" The silence that followed was deafening. Grace lowered her head, enduring the humiliation, but one of the investors shot an uncomfortable look at Ethan, who, embarrassed, tried to deflect the situation. That scene was etched in his mind. For the first time, he realized how Victoria's actions not only hurt, but also tarnished her image in the eyes of others. The excuses and justifications he'd repeated for months were no longer enough. What he saw now was naked cruelty, hurting those least able to defend themselves. That same night, unable to sleep, Ethan went down to the gardens. He found Grace, alone, gathering fallen petals from the rose bushes. The scene touched him more than he cared to. Admit, there was a delicacy in her gestures, a patience that contrasted sharply with the screams echoing in his mind. He approached slowly, and for a few seconds they were silent, listening only to the wind in the leaves. It was he who spoke first, in a low tone. "You're always here when everything seems to fall apart." Grace, surprised, simply nodded without looking up. But inside her, those words burned like an unexpected flame. As Ethan began to wake up to the truth, Victoria became increasingly impatient. In meetings, she openly pressured him to sign risky contracts, even slamming her hand on the table in frustration. "Don't you trust me?" she'd snap, her eyes flashing. Ethan, weary, would simply reply, "Trust doesn't require haste." The statement left her speechless, but the silence that followed was more revealing than any shout. Grace, though repeatedly humiliated, stood her ground. She didn't seek to confront Victoria, simply carrying on with her work, carrying with her a dignity that no slight could steal. The other employees were already beginning to be inspired by her demeanor. Small gestures appeared, a maid who helped her without being asked, a security guard who greeted her respectfully, a gardener who brought flowers to her room. The mansion, silent, seemed to choose whose side it was on. Victoria noticed this change. She felt increasingly threatened by the maid's invisible strength, who needed neither luxury nor words to gain respect. This realization filled her with hatred. She began to cast cold glances at Grace whenever she could, as if her very existence were a challenge. But what she didn't understand was that true power lay not in shouting the loudest, but in standing tall when everything around her crumbled. Fate, ever patient, was already sharpening its blades. Ethan, who had been blinded for so long by the false glow, was beginning to see clearly. And Grace, even unwittingly, became not only the counterpoint to Victoria's arrogance, but the very reason the house remained standing. Karma was approaching, and when it came, there would be no more masks to hide the truth. Victoria realized the ground was slipping away beneath her feet, and like someone trying to hold water with their hands, began to act without restraint. Orders became pressure, suggestions, emotional blackmail. One morning, she announced that she would donate, in Ethan's name, an absurd amount to a partner foundation and demanded that the finance department arrange the transfers by the end of the day. The pale administrator took the proposal to the owner before any action was taken. Ethan, tired, asked for documents. Victoria returned with a tight smile. "Don't be old-fashioned, it's networking." The word rang hollow. He, however, remained silent, feeling that arguing there would only make her louder. That same day, a diamond bracelet, an old gift from Ethan's mother kept in the library safe, went missing. Victoria gathered the team in the hall, accusing it of clear carelessness and targeting Grace as if choosing a target. Before the humiliation could solidify, the alert security chief quickly checked the records. The biometrics used on the safe belonged to an assistant recently appointed by Victoria, who was no longer in the house. Ethan's gaze met Grace's, who remained with her hands clasped, her face burning with unjust shame. Victoria laughed nervously, called it a system glitch, and locked herself in her room on the phone. Outside, the entire mansion held its breath. That night, Grace found a mail envelope in the hallway with Ethan's signature on it. Only the handwriting wasn't hers. The sender, a Phoenix-based consulting firm involved in a high-risk real estate project, the same one Victoria had been pushing for weeks. She didn't open it, didn't photograph it, didn't cross any lines that weren't hers. He simply left the package on her desk with a short note, his usual small handwriting. "Arrived without warning. I chose not to forward it." When Ethan walked in and saw the two papers side by side, the coincidence was no longer a coincidence. He asked legal to compare signatures. He asked the administrator to suspend temporary passwords. He asked himself to finally look at what he'd been avoiding. Victoria's response to feeling the brakes on was to turn up the volume. The story began to circulate that the house was full of internal sabotage, insinuating that certain employees weren't loyal. She made calls to columnists, put on crystal smiles for calculated photos, and wrote short messages to Ethan in the wee hours of the morning, alternating sweetness and menace. "If you expose me, I'll expose you," she said without saying. The man who had for so long confused brilliance with value was now witnessing the logic of the mirror. Those who promise more light usually fear clarity. The trigger came at a small business lunch, which Victoria turned into a test of strength. A long time. Partner asked about numbers from an annex. She cut him off mid-question and answered for Ethan as if the chair belonged to him. He took a deep breath and asked her not to speak on his behalf. A blush rose in her lap like a spark. When the meeting ended, she waited for him on the East Wing stairs and whispered through her teeth, "I made you respectable. Without me, you'll go back to being a lost rich kid." The sentence ignited something in him that wasn't anger. It was belated clarity. "Respect." "Doesn't shout," he said, and went downstairs, leaving behind a heavy perfume that could no longer cover the rust. In the pantry, Grace continued to weave the invisible order. He prepared tea for the team, discreetly moved the meeting with the most tense supplier to a less exposed room, and left a set of candles and flashlights near the light board, because the weather would change. When Ethan passed by, he saw the small forecasts lined up on a tray and understood, without poetry, what his father had always said about home: "You don't hold up a roof with speeches but with hands that work while no one applauds." That night, the promised storm gathered over the city. The first heavy drops were hitting the glass when the security chief rang the office bell with a flash drive. Footage from the garage showed a man in a cap accessing the service wing with a deactivated badge. Victoria's same assistant had forgotten an old active access. Ethan felt his stomach turn. He ordered secondary. Entrances sealed, reinforced shifts, and cancelled all passwords linked to recent hires. His phone vibrated with messages from Victoria outside, asking for a conversation now or never. He didn't answer. Grace, crossing the hallway, noticed the lights flickering and went down to the main control panel. It wasn't panic, it was method. She checked the circuit breakers, left the utility window open to let the house breathe, and alerted security over the radio. As she went upstairs, she saw Victoria. Standing on the upper landing, her dress impeccable, her eyes encapsulating an elegant fury. "You like playing heroine, don't you?" she said softly, as if striking a blow with a glove. Grace didn't return a word, she returned presence. And in that silent duel, the house chose. In the crack of lightning revealing the outline of each, it became clear who was root and who was wind. Ethan from the office closed the folder with the reports and made the decision he'd been putting off: a full audit, immediate removal of access, and a formal meeting with Victoria the next morning in the presence of the legal team. As he typed the email, a headlight swept the service entrance. The dark SUV stopped outside, engine running, windows tinted. The intercom rang with a hiss that carried through the house like an omen. On the gate's viewing window, the silhouette of a hooded man raised his old badge toward the camera, and the storm finally broke. The storm raged outside, as if it wanted to join in. The drama unfolding inside the mansion. The dark SUV parked outside the gate wasn't just a car, it was an omen. The security chief had ordered no one to open the gate, but the mere fact that someone was trying to enter with an old badge linked to Victoria's hiring was proof enough that she had crossed all lines. Ethan from the office watched the images on the screen with his jaw clenched, remembering every time he had ignored the signs. Beside him, Grace's forgotten note: "Beware of what shines." When the lights go out, seemed to take on an almost prophetic weight. Victoria, noticing the commotion, came down the stairs with a theatrical air, feigning surprise. "What's this fuss about?" she asked, trying to sound offended. But when Ethan turned around, holding the doctored reports and evidence of unauthorized access, her face no longer held any hesitation. "Enough, Victoria. It's over." Those words, spoken firmly, echoed like a final sentence. She laughed nervously, approached with slow steps, and tried to justify herself. "Everything I did was to protect you, to protect us. You don't understand the pressure I'm under." But deep in her eyes there was no regret. There was fury at having been exposed. The confrontation quickly escalated. Ethan, evidence in hand, explained to a few assembled staff members, "She not only tried to manipulate my business, but she also put this house at risk." The security chief confirmed the connection between the SUV and a contact of Victoria's. The employees, previously forced to endure her humiliations, now stared at her in silence, but there was no fear on their faces, only relief at seeing the truth finally exposed. Grace, standing discreetly in the background, felt her hands trembling, but not from fear. It was as if the full weight of the humiliations she had endured had been borne in this moment. Victoria lost control. The impeccable woman, who had always measured every word, now screamed, accusing everyone of betrayal. "You are ungrateful. None of this would exist without me." Her voice echoed through the hall, but no one responded. The collective silence was more devastating than any retort. It was at that moment that she realized she had lost not only her power, but also her audience. The brilliance she had so cultivated had faded, and only darkness remained. Ethan, remaining calm, asked her to leave the mansion. There was no more room for negotiation, no more second chances. The driver brought her bags, all ready, packed by her boss's orders. The rain was falling heavily as Victoria crossed the hall for the last time. She tried to maintain her composure, to lift her chin, but her footsteps sounded hollow, and each drop that hit the glass seemed to mark the rhythm of her defeat. When the door closed behind her, a profound silence filled the mansion. It wasn't the silence of fear, nor the silence of humiliation, but the silence of collective relief. The servants breathed more easily, and for the first time, in a long time, Grace felt the air lift from her shoulders. Ethan stood still for a few seconds, staring at the closed door, until he took a deep breath, as if finally releasing a burden he'd been carrying for months. That night, after everyone had retired, he walked alone to the garden. The storm had given way to a light drizzle, and the roses, still wet, exuded a soft fragrance. There, faced with the simplicity of nature, he realized he had been blind for too long. It wasn't in the glitter of jewels or expensive perfume that one found value. It was in the silent presence of one who sustained everything without asking for anything in return. And when he turned his eyes toward the house, he saw, through the pantry window, Grace writing something down in her notebook, tireless even after everything. Fate had spoken. Victoria had reaped what she sowed: manipulation, arrogance, and lies. But the universe still had something greater in store for Grace, the young woman who, despite being scorned and humiliated, remained true to her essence. Karma had served its first part, but the final twist remained, the one that would transform pain into dignity and silence into recognition. Victoria's departure left visible marks on the mansion, but not of destruction, rather of relief. It was as if the walls, once tense and suffocating in her presence, now breathed in silence. The corridors that echoed with harsh orders filled with a lighter air. The servants once again conversed among themselves without fear of reprisal, and even the small sounds of routine, the clinking of cups, the gardener's whistle, a maid's restrained laughter, sounded like music of reconciliation. The house seemed to have returned to being a home, not a stage. Grace felt this change in every detail. For the first time in months, she walked without the constant weight of venomous stares. She could concentrate on her tasks without fear of public humiliation, but despite the calm that was descending, her heart still carried the shadow of the pain she had suffered. On lonely nights in her room, she recalled every insult, every tear swallowed in silence. Yet, there was a breath of hope within her, the feeling that fate had not allowed so much pain without a purpose. Ethan, for his part, was different, quieter, more reflective. He spent hours in the office reviewing contracts, trying to correct mistakes and make up for lost time. But it wasn't just business he was concerned with. As the days passed, he found himself observing Grace in small gestures, arranging flowers, writing in notebooks, serving the table with the care of someone who puts love into everything they do. These simple moments touched him more than the luxuries he'd been accustomed to. It was as if, finally, he was beginning to see what had always been right before his eyes. One afternoon, as he walked through the pantry, Ethan found Grace discreetly adjusting the dining room lighting. The sun beat down on her face, illuminating her tired but determined eyes. He paused for a moment, unsure how to start a conversation. Finally, he murmured, "You always take care of everything, even the things no one notices." Grace blushed in surprise and simply replied, "It's my job, sir." But deep down, those words carried more than simple humility. They were the expression of her essence, to serve in silence, even when no one recognized her. Gradually, the distance between them began to diminish. Ethan began to thank her. For small things, a tidy report, a cup of tea left on his desk, a detail she'd fixed without being asked. For Grace, each thank you was unexpected, almost painful, as if it were dangerous to believe there could be anything beyond orders and obligations. Still, she couldn't help but feel her heart race every time their eyes met. Meanwhile, news about Victoria continued to spread. Her business affairs were collapsing in public, her allies were abandoning her, and her image was rapidly deteriorating. The contrast was stark. The woman who had once claimed power was now remembered only as an example of the arrogance that led to her downfall. And in the mansion, the young maid she had once scorned was now seen as the invisible foundation that held everything together. One night, when the house was already asleep, Ethan found Grace in the garden, watering the roses under the moonlight. He approached silently and stood there for a few seconds, simply observing. Then he said softly, "These flowers bloom because you care for them. I don't think I ever realized how much everything here depends on you." Grace, surprised, tried to look away, but he insisted, "I'm also only standing because you kept this house alive when everything seemed to be falling apart." His simple words fell on her like a balm. For the first time, she felt she wasn't invisible. Fate, silently, prepared the next step. Karma had already served Victoria justice, but it still had its second part to fulfill, transforming Grace's silence and pain into dignity, recognition, and perhaps love. The morning arrived bearing the weight of agreements that could no longer wait. Even before breakfast, Ethan's cell phone buzzed with messages from the legal department, the bank, and two investors who months ago had applauded his brilliance and now demanded figures as if they had never toasted together. The external audit had revealed a trail of commitments made during the period when Victoria reigned supreme. Over invitations and promises, there was a letter of intent with unfair clauses, hidden fees, and a payment schedule that, if executed, would force the hasty sale of a key asset. The email from the most obstinate partner was a polite ultimatum. Sign the addendum by 5 p.m. and we'll preserve the credit. Refuse and we'll publish a statement about your instability. The word, in quotation marks, stinged like a calculated insult. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, standing at the office window watching the garden begin to recover. It wasn't Victoria's voice that haunted him anymore, it was his own. In the months he'd mistaken speed for vision. He knew saying yes would ease the pressure of the day, but it would tie him to the same mistake that had nearly destroyed his home. Opening the door, he found the mansion waking up, the smell of warm bread wafting from the pantry, the gardener's soft whistle, life reclaiming its place. And in the hallway, he passed Grace carrying a simple briefcase, the kind that promises nothing but order. She didn't dare cross the office line. She stood in the doorway, asking permission with her eyes. She had spread the contracts on his desk the day before to clear his head, and out of habit had labeled the pages with deadlines and attachments. "Excuse me, sir, I saw you had different versions of the same document and I marked the discrepancies in pencil. I can erase them." There was no boldness in the statement, only care. He invited her in, and for a few minutes they followed the trail of sticky notes like someone chasing footprints after rain. In one of the attachments, Grace pointed out a detail that hadn't been in the old draft. A missing clause, written in smaller type, that shifted jurisdiction to a distant county and tied personal guarantees to a fund he would never touch. "I don't understand the law, but that line wasn't here before," he said, almost apologizing for noticing the obvious. Ethan felt his spine tingle. He called the lawyer, put the call on speakerphone, and within minutes he heard the confirmation he'd feared. This was the trap that would turn the addendum into a leash. The opinion was curt. If he signed, he'd spend years paying for the mistake of the last few months. Silence. The clock read 10:17 a.m., the deadline ticking like sand through an hourglass. The partner persisted by text, offering reputational protection in exchange for the signature. The phrase, so polite, sounded like a perfumed threat. That's when Ethan looked at the table and noticed the contrast. On one side, the contract with small print promising a quick peace. On the other, the cardboard folder with pencil labels and the tiny handwriting of someone who organizes the world without asking for anything. There was no grand epiphany, just the clarity of a choice. He took a deep breath, called the administrator and legal team, gathered the team in the kitchen, the only room where the truth always fit, and spoke without a speech. He wouldn't sign. He preferred to endure headlines than perpetuate a mistake. They would cut ties with those who profited in the shadows, renegotiate with those who wanted to remain in the spotlight, sell an idle plot of land bought out of vanity years before, but they would protect what mattered. Grace in the corner stood motionless with the cup in her hands, trying not to tremble. The administrator, who had known Ethan's father, narrowed his eyes in an old-fashioned gesture of approval. The legal department took quick notes. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't fear of the next blow, it was the gravity of a chosen course. When the meeting ended, everyone left knowing what to do. Ethan stayed, and so did the young woman who had unknowingly put everything back on track. He approached slowly, as if afraid to startle a bird. "You saved me from signing my own shipwreck," he said, without exaggeration. "Not because you understand finance, but because you understand attention. You're the one I need close to me when everything seems to be falling apart." She wanted to reply that she'd only done what anyone would do, but that phrase wasn't a bargaining chip. It was a confession. For a moment, the cup felt too small for what lay between them. He didn't say, "Stay with me," or "I owe you." He said, "I trust." And the word, so often overused, took on a new meaning. He asked that, from that day on, she formally help him review the house's routine and the interface with the office. No grand titles, just the authority of someone who knows where everything belongs. It wasn't a showcase promotion, it was a deep-rooted recognition. When the clock struck 4:58 p.m., The partner sent the final message. "So," Ethan replied with 3 clear lines without adjectives, warning that he would not sign, that he would publish a note explaining the decision, and that he kept the door open to renegotiating on clean grounds. He turned off the screen and walked out into the garden. The afternoon light fell on the flower beds like redemption. Grace walked a few steps ahead, checking to see if the roses had suffered from the previous night's wind. He caught up with her, and for a second they both paused before a stem that was leaning too far. With their fingertips, they held the stem together until it rested firmly on the stake. A small gesture, a huge symbol. Some things only stand when 2 hands choose the same side. In the living room, the phone began to vibrate with predictable reactions. Criticism, timid applause, promises of retaliation. In the garden, the sound was different. The day was ending without headline-grabbing heroism, but with the certainty that, among all the voices surrounding him, Ethan had finally identified the only one guiding him without noise. It wasn't the voice that called for light. It was the one that kept the fire burning when the power went out. And this voice had a name, small hands, and a courage that never asked for a witness. Fate, satisfied, took note. The final test was not to defeat the enemy from without, but to untie within the heart the knot that confuses brilliance with valor. From that point on, history would move forward not by impulse, but by choice, and the first of these had already been made. Ethan's refusal to sign the addendum fell like a silent thunderclap across the business world. Within hours, the messages multiplied. Some partners accused him of being reckless, others of finally finding courage. Financial blogs reported the decision as bold, while gossip columns attempted to link the episode to mysterious, internal influences. His stock price fluctuated, as if reflecting the tension in his own soul. But inside the mansion, the atmosphere was different. There was a new calm, the result of a weight lifted from his shoulders. This calm, however, was short-lived. Victoria, even though she was away, was still trying to pull one final trick. That same week, she made a surprise appearance at a gala social event, surrounded by journalists, wearing a smile that hid desperation. Before the cameras, she stated that she possessed compromising information about Ethan's personal life and about an improper relationship between an employer and an employee. The words fell like poison amid the lights of the room. Some laughed disdainfully, others eagerly wrote them down. It was her last weapon, turning the truth into a scandal. When the news reached the mansion, the entire staff froze. Grace, hearing her name echoed in rumors, felt the ground drop from under her feet. Tears came quickly, not from guilt, but from fear of becoming, once again, a source of shame. She wanted to disappear within the walls that had always hidden her. But this time she wasn't alone. Ethan gathered the staff in the pantry and spoke with the firmness he'd inherited from his father. No one here needs to be afraid. There is no scandal, only the truth, and it is the truth that will sustain us. For the first time, he defended Grace in public, making it clear that her presence was vital, not a source of suspicion. As Victoria attempted to burnish her reputation, the truth began to emerge. Investigative journalists, drawn by the hype, found documents and witnesses confirming her wrongdoing, reports of shell companies, illegal access, even records of attempted fraud on behalf of third parties. Within days, the narrative turned against her. What had begun as a defamatory accusation turned into headlines about the fraud of the woman who nearly destroyed an empire. Grace, even relieved, still felt exposed. One night, sitting on the kitchen steps, she quietly confessed to the gardener, "I didn't want him to suffer anymore because of me." But the old man only smiled and replied, "My daughter, you didn't bring any burden. You brought light. And anyone who doesn't see that doesn't deserve to be here." The simple words penetrated deeply, calming her heart. Ethan, on the other hand, was no longer swayed by external pressure. With Victoria finally unmasked, he made a symbolic decision. He called a press conference, but not in hotels or ballrooms. He made a point of speaking from the mansion's garden, in front of the greenhouses built by his father. There, surrounded by the employees who had always supported his household, He declared that he was reorganizing his business on a transparent basis, eliminating all corrupt contracts and, most importantly, creating a fund dedicated to the families of the workers who had been with him for years. The gesture, broadcast on camera, was met with respect by many and with embarrassed silence by some critics. But what really mattered was that, for the first time, he spoke not as the heir to a fortune, but as a man who had learned from his mistakes. At the bottom of the garden, Grace watched with tears in her eyes. She had never sought recognition, never dreamed of being mentioned, but she knew that this moment too bore her mark. The note left weeks ago, the notebooks, every invisible gesture that had kept the house standing amidst the chaos, all of it had contributed to this turning point. Victoria, upon seeing the press conference broadcast, realized there was no more room for her narrative. Her final card had backfired. Patient karma now delivered what had always been reserved for her: isolation and public ruin. The world she had built on illusions crumbled before everyone's eyes. At the mansion, however, night fell lightly. Ethan walked to the pantry, found Grace silently putting away the dinner plates, and said in a low but firm tone, "You don't have to hide. Not ever again." Those words, as simple as the dawn, marked the beginning of a change that could no longer be denied. Fate still held the final act, but the path was clear. From humiliation would come dignity, and from contempt, love. The mansion, now freed from Victoria's weight, breathed differently. The sound of voices was lighter. Quiet laughter once again filled the hallways, and even the garden seemed to bloom with more life. But in Grace's heart, the doubt still lingered. Could she finally be seen, not just as a servant, but as someone with value beyond her invisible tasks? The days passed, and although the humiliations of yesteryear were now mere memories, the fear of believing in something greater kept her silent. Ethan, for his part, had changed. More serene, more present, more human. He was no longer the man fascinated by appearances. There was a new humility in him, shaped by the weight of mistakes. He saw the mark of Grace's hand in every detail of the house, in the flowers that were always fresh, in the lights that never failed, in the silent care that made everything work. He began to look for her in the hallways, no longer as a boss, but as someone who needed her presence to ground him. One afternoon, returning from a tiring meeting, Ethan found Grace in the library, stacking books she'd misplaced. He stood in the doorway watching her silently. There was a gentleness in his gestures, but also strength. When she noticed him, she lowered her eyes and murmured, "Sorry, sir, I was just organizing." He leaned closer and replied, "You do more than organize, you keep everything together." The sentence made Grace tremble inside, but she only smiled slightly, cherishing that moment like one guarding a hidden treasure. That evening, Ethan gathered the team in the lantern-lit garden. In a firm voice, he announced the official creation of the fund dedicated to the families of employees, a project left by his father and now realized. He looked toward Grace, without mentioning her directly, but everyone understood where the inspiration had come from. The applause that echoed was genuine, born of the gratitude of someone who had long lived invisibly. Grace, at the back of the crowd, felt her heart race, but remained discreet, as always. A few days later, in Paigi, an unexpected gesture, Ethan invited her to accompany him on a visit to the family greenhouse. Grace hesitated, but accepted. They walked among the plants, and he explained how that space had been his father's pride and joy. They stopped before a vase of roses that she herself had secretly tended. Ethan pointed to the flowers and said, "These roses bloomed because you tended them, and I too am standing because you held me up when I could see nothing." The words hung in the air like a confession. Grace, overcome with emotion, looked away, but couldn't hold back the tears that flowed discreetly. In that moment, Ethan understood that there were no longer barriers between master and maid, wealth and simplicity. What existed was truth, and that was what mattered. He approached, gently wiped her tears and said, "I don't want you to hide anymore. I don't want you to be invisible." Grace tried to protest, but her voice faltered. The silence that followed spoke louder than any words. Meanwhile, news of Victoria became increasingly distant, almost irrelevant. Karma had done its work for her. Now fate prepared the final act, not of humiliation, but of redemption. The young woman who had been scorned was about to see her pain transformed into love, and the mansion, the scene of silent tears, would witness the most unexpected turn of events. The victory of a sincere heart. Spring brought a different scent to the Crawford mansion. The roses bloomed brighter, the hallways were brighter, and for the first time in a long time no heavy shadows hung over the home. Victoria's absence was no longer a source of comment or curiosity. It was merely a distant echo of a time when false brightness deceived everyone. Now, the house seemed to finally find its balance. But fate still had one final scene in store, the one that would transform silence into words and invisibility into love. Grace followed her routine as always, attending to every detail without seeking recognition. Even though she felt the weight of small signals from Ethan, she didn't allow herself to believe in anything beyond the obligation of her job. Her heart, scarred by the pain of humiliation, insisted on reminding her that she was just the maid. But behind the discipline, there was a timid, almost imperceptible hope that bloomed like the roses in the garden. Ethan, on the other hand, could no longer hide his feelings. Her every gesture was a revelation to him. It wasn't the lavish dinners or the grand gatherings that brought him peace. It was her presence, always firm, always genuine. In recent months, he had learned that fortune isn't measured in numbers, but in the strength of the people who remain when everything falls apart. And of all people, she alone was there, even when invisible. One Sunday afternoon, he decided he couldn't put it off any longer. He found Grace in the greenhouse, tending to the roses that were just beginning to bloom. The sun streamed through the windows, illuminating her face, marked by weariness but also serenity. He stood still for a few seconds, simply observing, until he said softly, "Whenever I see these flowers, I remember they only exist because you protected them. I never realized how much everything depended on you, including me." Grace froze, unsure of what to say. She lowered her eyes, trying to hide the tears that were welling up. "I'm just doing my job, sir," she murmured, but her voice cracked. Ethan approached, extended his hand and gently lifted her face. "You're not just a maid. You were the strength of this house when I was blind. You saved me without asking for anything in return. I don't want you to live in the shadows anymore. I want you to walk beside me." The words pierced Grace like a beam of light. For an instant, everything around her seemed to fall silent. The pain of the past, the tears swallowed in silence, the humiliations suffered in front of Victoria, all of it dissolved in that moment. She, who had so often felt invisible, was now seen, and not just seen but chosen. Ethan held her hands, those same hands that served trays and wiped away hidden tears, and added, "I can't change what happened, but I can choose differently from now on. I don't just want to say thank you, I want to love you the way you always deserved to be loved." Grace couldn't hold back her tears. She cried, but this time not from pain, but from relief, from redemption. And finally, he allowed himself to believe. He allowed himself to love. The two of them drew closer, and among the roses she had grown herself, sealed their fate with a soft kiss, not one of hasty passion, but of recognition and surrender. That night, the mansion witnessed a different scene. Grace didn't sit alone in the pantry, nor retreat to her hidden room. For the first time, he took a seat at the main table next to Ethan. The servants, surprised but moved, understood that this wasn't a breach of hierarchy. It was justice. It was karma returning in due time, every tear that had been shed in silence. While Victoria faced her public downfall, reaping what she had sown with arrogance and lies, Grace received what she always deserved: dignity, respect, and love. The contrast was clear, almost poetic. The false shine had faded, but the true roots flourished. The story concluded as it should, with the truth revealed, with love conquering contempt, and with the certainty that no one humbles a sincere heart without fate, transforming their pain into victory. And there, among roses that had once witnessed tears, now blossomed the unexpected romance of two worlds that seemed too distant, but that karma brought together at just the right time. If this story touched your heart, leave a like so more people can feel it too. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories full of emotion and twists, and tell me in the comments, do you believe true love can be born where you least expect it? Until the next story.